The scream tore through the canyon just as Cade Rawlins rounded the bend along the Platte River, his muscles tensing beneath his buckskin shirt as he jerked his horse to a halt and scanned the towering rock formations that lined the water. It was August 1878, and the summer heat had turned the Nebraska landscape into a shimmering expanse of gold and green, the river running lower than usual after weeks without rain. Cade had been tracking a mountain lion for 3 days, following its path from the Rocky Highlands down toward the settlements near North Platte. But that sound made his blood run cold in a way no predator ever could. That was pure human terror, high-pitched and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls. His gray eyes swept the cliff face across the river, searching for the source. There, 50 feet up on a narrow ledge that jutted out from the weathered sandstone, he saw her. A woman in a blue calico dress, pressed flat against the rock, her arms spread wide as she clutched at handholds that looked no bigger than his fingers. Even from this distance, he could see her entire body shaking. Cade kicked his horse forward, guiding the animal into the shallow water without hesitation. The river ran only knee-deep here in late summer, and his mount picked its way across the rocky bottom with practiced ease. His mind was already calculating angles and routes, years of living in these mountains teaching him to read stone the way other men read books. That ledge she was on looked like it had crumbled away recently, probably from the rain they'd had a week ago loosening the sediment. She must have been climbing and gotten stuck when her path forward gave way. "Hold on," he called up to her, his deep voice carrying easily across the space between them. "Do not move. I am coming up." "I cannot hold on much longer," she cried back, and he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. How long had she been up there? Her arms had to be screaming with fatigue, her fingers going numb from gripping the rock. Cade reached the base of the cliff and swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. His 6'4" frame built from years of surviving in the wilderness that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the plains of Nebraska. His shoulders were broad enough that he'd had to have his shirt specially made by the tailor in North Platte, and his arms were thick with muscle from climbing, hunting, and hauling everything he needed to survive. His dark brown hair hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord to keep it out of his face, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his solitary lifestyle. He studied the cliff face with the intensity of a man whose life had depended on such assessments more times than he could count. The sandstone here was layered and weathered, which meant plenty of handholds but also meant the rock could be unstable. He tested the first grip, then pulled himself up with arms that barely strained at his own considerable weight. "What is your name?" He called up as he climbed, wanting to keep her talking, keep her focused on something other than the drop beneath her feet. "Bethany," she answered, her voice trembling. "Bethany Nash. I am Cade Rawlins. How did you get up there, Bethany?" "I was trying to reach a hawk's nest." "I am a naturalist, studying the wildlife in Nebraska. I thought the ledge would hold, but it started crumbling when I got this far." "A naturalist." That explained why a woman would be out here alone, though it did not explain why she had attempted such a dangerous climb without proper equipment or assistance. Cade filed away his questions for later and focused on the ascent, his fingers finding purchase in cracks and crevices, his boots wedging into narrow gaps between layers of stone. The sun beat down on his back, and sweat rolled down his spine beneath his shirt. Below him, the river glinted in the afternoon light, and he could hear the distant call of a hawk, probably the very bird whose nest had lured Bethany Nash into this predicament. He was 20 feet up now, then 30, moving with the confidence of a man who had spent half his 32 years scaling mountains and cliffs in pursuit of game or simply because the view from the top was worth the effort. "I can see you," Bethany called down, and there was a note of hope in her voice that made Cade's chest tighten. People did not usually sound hopeful when they saw him. In town, mothers pulled their children closer when he walked by, and men gave him a wide berth, intimidated by his size and his reputation. But this woman, stranded 50 feet above the river with death one slipped grip away, heard salvation in his approach. "Stay still," he ordered, pulling himself up another few feet. He was close enough now to see her properly. She looked to be in her middle 20s, with honey-colored hair that had come loose from its pins and now hung in tangled waves around her face. Her dress was torn at the hem, and her hands were scraped raw from gripping the stone. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide and green and filled with an intelligence that shone through even her terror. 40 feet up. 45. The ledge she stood on was even narrower than it had looked from below, barely wide enough for her slender frame. How she had maintained her balance this long was a testament to either incredible willpower or sheer stubbornness. Probably both. "When I reach you," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I am going to position myself beside you. Then I will help you get into a secure position so we can climb down together. Can you do that?" "I think so." Her voice wavered, but she nodded. "You have been very brave," he told her, and meant it. Lesser people would have panicked and fallen long before now. Cade pulled himself up the final few feet, his muscles burning with the effort of the rapid climb. He wedged his left boot into a solid crack and tested his weight before reaching up to grip the edge of her ledge. With a grunt of effort, he hauled himself up until he stood beside her, his back against the cliff face, one arm braced on either side to keep his balance. The ledge was even more precarious than he had feared. Standing this close to her, he could feel the trembling that racked her entire body, could see the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the rock face. Her lips were pale, and her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. "Look at me," he commanded softly, and her eyes met his. Up close, they were the color of new grass in spring, flecked with gold near the pupils. "You are going to be fine. I will not let you fall." "You do not even know me," she whispered. "Does not matter. You are under my protection now." Something in his words seemed to steady her. She took a deeper breath, and some of the panic faded from her gaze. "I am going to put my arm around you," Cade said. "When I do, I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Bethany nodded, not trusting her voice. Cade shifted his weight carefully, testing each handhold before committing to it. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, he wrapped his right arm around her waist, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest. She was tiny compared to him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, and he could feel every tremor that ran through her. "Hold on to me," he instructed. "Wrap your arms around my neck." She hesitated for only a moment before obeying, her arms coming up to circle his neck. Her fingers locked together behind his head, and suddenly she was pressed fully against him, her face buried in the hollow of his throat. "I have got you," he murmured, and felt her nod against his chest. What followed was the most harrowing descent Cade had ever attempted. With Bethany clinging to him, he had to support both their weights while finding handholds and footholds that would bear them. His arms screamed with the effort, his fingers aching as they gripped the stone, but he forced himself to move with careful precision. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and they would both plummet to the rocks below. Bethany kept her face pressed against his chest the entire time, her eyes squeezed shut, her breath warm against his throat. She did not make a sound, did not protest or cry out even when his movements shifted her weight or his grip tightened around her waist. The trust she placed in him was absolute and humbling. Inch by agonizing inch, they descended. 30 feet. 20. Cade's muscles burned like fire, and sweat stung his eyes, but he did not stop, did not slow. He could feel Bethany's heartbeat hammering against his chest, could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair despite the dust and fear that clung to them both. When his boots finally touched solid ground, his legs nearly buckled with relief. He stood there for a long moment, his arms still locked around Bethany, both of them breathing hard. The river burbled beside them, and his horse nickered softly from where it stood a few yards away. "We are down," he said quietly. "You are safe now." Bethany lifted her head from his chest, and he saw that tears had traced clean tracks down her dusty cheeks. She stared up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and something passed between them, some wordless acknowledgement that connected them more deeply than any introduction could have managed. "Thank you," she breathed. "You saved my life." "What in God's name were you thinking, climbing up there alone?" The words came out harsher than he intended, but the fear he had felt during that descent was transforming into anger now that they were safe. Bethany stiffened in his arms, and he realized he was still holding her. He released her abruptly and stepped back, putting distance between them. "I was thinking that I might get photographs of hawk eggs that no one has documented before," she said, lifting her chin despite the tremor still in her voice. "I was thinking that advancing scientific knowledge sometimes requires taking risks. It nearly required your death, but it did not because you came along." They stared at each other, neither willing to back down until Cade shook his head in reluctant admiration. She had nearly died, had been moments away from falling, and here she stood defending her choices. Stubborn did not begin to cover it. "Where is your camp?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain level. "About a mile upstream. I left my equipment there. Can you walk?" Bethany took a tentative step and winced. Looking down, Cade saw that her feet were bare, her boots apparently lost during her ordeal on the cliff. The ground here was covered in sharp rocks and thorny brush. Without a word, he strode to his horse and pulled a spare pair of moccasins from his saddlebag. They would be far too large for her, but they would protect her feet for the walk back to her camp. "Here," he said, offering them to her. Bethany accepted them with a murmur of thanks and sat down on a nearby boulder to pull them on. Cade watched as she tied the leather laces around her ankles, noting the way her hands still shook. The fear had not left her yet, for all her brave words. "I will escort you back to your camp," he said, brooking no argument. "Then we need to talk about what you are doing out here alone." "I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Bethany protested, rising to her feet. Cade raised one eyebrow and looked pointedly at the cliff face behind them. Color flooded her cheeks. "That was an isolated incident." "How many other isolated incidents have you had?" "None," she said quickly, too quickly. Cade sighed and gathered his horse's reins. "Come on. The sun will set in a few hours, and I want to see this camp of yours before dark." They walked in silence, following the river upstream. Cade led his horse and kept pace with Bethany's slower gait, noting the way she favored her right foot and the occasional wince that crossed her face. She was likely covered in bruises from being pressed against that rock face for however long she had been stuck up there. "How long were you on that ledge?" he asked after a while. "About 3 hours," she admitted. "I climbed up in the early afternoon. The ledge crumbled around 2 o'clock, I think. I lost my pocket watch in the scramble. 3 hours." His jaw tightened. 3 hours of clinging to that rock face, her muscles screaming, knowing that one wrong move meant death, and she had held on. "You are stronger than you look," he said gruffly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I get that from my father. He was a surveyor used to scaling heights and mapping terrain. I grew up following him on his expeditions." "Was? He died 2 years ago, fever. I am sorry. Thank you, he would have loved this country. She gestured at the landscape around them, the rolling plains giving way to rocky formations, the river cutting its ancient path through stone. He always said Nebraska was underappreciated. Most people just pass through on their way to somewhere else, Cade agreed. They do not stop to really look, but you do. It was not a question, and he glanced at her in surprise. She was studying him with those intelligent green eyes, and he had the unsettling feeling that she saw more than most people did. I have lived out here for 10 years, he said. You learn to appreciate the details. Why did you come out here? To the wilderness, I mean. Most people want to live in towns. Cade was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to tell this stranger who had crashed into his life so dramatically. I did not fit well in towns. Too many people, too many rules. Out here a man can breathe. You are not from Nebraska originally, Montana Territory, but I have wandered south over the years. They crested a small rise and Bethany pointed ahead. There, that is my camp. Cade saw a small canvas tent pitched in a grove of cottonwood trees near the river, with what looked like scientific equipment spread out on a makeshift table made from boards laid across stumps. Books were stacked carefully on top of a wooden crate, protected from the elements by an oilcloth. A well-organized fire pit sat cold and clean, with a coffee pot resting on a flat stone beside it. As they approached, Cade took in more details. The camp showed signs of someone who knew what they were doing in the wilderness. Everything was neat and purposeful, supplies stored properly to protect them from animals and weather. But it was still the camp of someone alone, vulnerable to the dangers that stalked these lands. How long have you been out here? He asked. 2 weeks. I am conducting a survey of the bird populations along the Platte River for the Smithsonian Institution. I have another 2 weeks planned before I return to North Platte. You cannot stay out here alone for 2 more weeks, Cade said flatly. Bethany's eyes flashed. I most certainly can. I have all the supplies I need, and I know how to handle myself. You nearly died today. And I would have died if not for you, which I am eternally grateful for, but that does not give you the right to dictate what I can and cannot do. Cade felt frustration building in his chest. Why were intelligent people so often lacking in basic common sense? There are dangers out here beyond falling off cliffs, mountain lions, occasionally bears, rattlesnakes, and worse, there are men who would see a woman alone as an opportunity. Bethany's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I have a job to do and I cannot abandon it because of one mishap that nearly killed you. Many things nearly kill people every day. Life is risk. Life does not have to be foolish risk. They glared at each other, locked in a battle of wills. In the fading afternoon light, with her hair wild around her face and her green eyes blazing with determination, Bethany Nash was possibly the most beautiful and infuriating woman Cade had ever encountered. I will make you a deal, he said finally. I will help you with your survey for the next 2 weeks. Extra hands will make the work go faster and you will have someone to watch your back. Bethany blinked in surprise. You would do that, but I cannot pay you. The Smithsonian budget is already stretched thin. I do not want your money. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of rescuing you. She scowled at him. I am not entertainment. You nearly fell off a cliff trying to photograph hawks. That is more excitement than I have had in months. Despite herself, Bethany's lips twitched. When you put it that way, it does sound rather absurd. It was absurd. It was also brave and possibly brilliant if you had succeeded, but mostly absurd. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. You can help with the survey. But I am in charge of the scientific observations and you have to follow my directions. Cade suppressed a grin. She was negotiating terms as if she had any leverage in this situation. Agreed. But when it comes to matters of safety and survival, I am in charge. Non-negotiable. Bethany considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. They shook hands on it, her small palm disappearing into his large, calloused one. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Cade, and from the way Bethany's eyes widened, he thought she might have felt it too. They held the handshake a moment longer than necessary before both pulling away. I should make camp, Cade said, his voice rougher than usual. I will be close enough to hear if you need anything. You could camp here, Bethany offered, gesturing to the grove. There is plenty of space, and it would be more practical for working together. It would be more practical, but it would also be more intimate. Still, she had a point. And after what had happened today, he did not like the idea of being too far away if she needed help again. All right, he agreed, but I will set up on the other side of the grove, propriety and all that. I think propriety went out the window when I wrapped my arms around your neck on that cliff face, Bethany said. But there was a blush on her cheeks that told him she was not as bold as her words suggested. Cade led his horse to a spot about 30 yards from her tent, far enough for decency, but close enough to respond to any threat. As he unsaddled his mount and began setting up his own camp, he found his thoughts drifting back to the feeling of Bethany in his arms, the trust in her eyes, the way she had pressed against him during that harrowing descent. He had lived alone for so long, by choice and by circumstance. People found him intimidating, and he preferred the company of mountains and rivers to the complicated social dances that happened in towns. But something about Bethany Nash called to him in a way he had not experienced before. Maybe it was the way she faced her fears head-on, or the passion in her voice when she talked about her work. Maybe it was simply that she looked at him and saw someone worth trusting rather than someone to fear. Whatever it was, Cade had the distinct feeling that the next 2 weeks were going to change his life in ways he could not yet imagine. As dusk settled over the river valley, Cade built a fire and put coffee on to boil. The familiar ritual of making camp soothed him, and he found his thoughts settling into the quiet rhythm of wilderness living. Across the grove, he could see Bethany moving around her tent, hanging her torn dress to be mended later and changing into what looked like more practical trousers and a man's shirt. He quickly looked away, giving her privacy, but not before noting that she seemed to have recovered remarkably well from her ordeal. "Do you want coffee?" he called over. "I would love some," she called back. A few minutes later, she emerged from behind her tent, properly dressed, and walked over to his fire. She had attempted to tame her hair, pulling it back in a simple braid that hung over one shoulder. Cade poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. She accepted it with a grateful smile and sat down on a log he had pulled near the fire. "I should probably explain what I was actually trying to do today," she said after taking a sip. "Before you conclude that I am completely reckless, I am listening. There is a species of hawk that nests in these cliffs. The Smithsonian believes it might be a variant of the red-tailed hawk, but no one has been able to document it properly because the nests are so inaccessible. I brought a camera and climbing equipment specifically to try to get photographs and collect data on their nesting habits." "Where is this climbing equipment?" Bethany had the grace to look sheepish. "I left most of it at the base of the cliff. It was heavy, and I thought the climb looked easy enough without it. And that is why you nearly died." "Yes, well, I have learned my lesson about underestimating cliffs." Cade took a drink of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. "Tell me about this survey you are doing." Bethany's entire demeanor changed. She sat up straighter, and her eyes lit with enthusiasm. "The Smithsonian wants a comprehensive catalog of bird species along the Platte River. Migration patterns, nesting sites, population estimates, feeding behaviors. Everything," I have been documenting every species I encounter, sketching them, taking notes on their behaviors. When I can get close enough, I photograph them. You carry a camera out here, a small one, portable. It is not ideal, but it is better than nothing. She gestured toward her tent. I have documented 17 different species so far. Some are common, but others I have not seen recorded in this region before, like your cliff-dwelling hawks. Exactly, she smiled ruefully, though I may need to find a safer way to document them. I know those cliffs, Cade said slowly. I have hunted in these canyons for years. There is another nest lower down, more accessible. I could show you tomorrow if you want. Bethany's face lit up. Really? You would do that? That is why I am here, is it not? To help with your survey. They talked late into the night, Bethany describing her work and Cade sharing his knowledge of the land. He found himself fascinated by the way her mind worked, how she could look at a bird and see not just a creature but a puzzle to be solved, a story to be told through careful observation and documentation. And she, in turn, seemed genuinely interested in his experiences living in the wilderness, asking thoughtful questions about the patterns of animal behavior he had observed over the years. When the fire burned low and exhaustion finally caught up with them both, Bethany stood to return to her tent. "Thank you again," she said softly, "for saving me today. I know I have been somewhat difficult about accepting help, but I truly am grateful." "You were not difficult," Cade said, rising as well. "Stubborn maybe, independent but not difficult. Is there a difference, a big one?" He smiled and was rewarded by an answering smile from her. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start your survey properly." That night, lying in his bedroll under the stars, Cade found sleep elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bethany pressed against that cliff face, saw the terror in her eyes, felt the weight of her in his arms as they descended. The fear he had felt in those moments surprised him with its intensity. He had seen death many times, had faced it himself more often than he cared to count. But the thought of this woman, this brave, stubborn, brilliant woman, falling to her death filled him with a dread that went bone deep. He barely knew her. They had met mere hours ago. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside him on that cliff face. Some certainty that his life had just changed course in a way he could not quite define. Across the grove, a light still burned in Bethany's tent, and he wondered if she was having similar trouble sleeping. Was she reliving those hours on the cliff, thinking about how close she had come to dying? Or was she bent over her notes and sketches, already planning tomorrow's work with the single-minded focus he had already come to associate with her? The night sounds of the prairie surrounded him, crickets and distant coyotes, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves, the endless murmur of the river. This had been his lullaby for 10 years, the soundtrack to a life lived in solitude. But tonight, knowing that Bethany was just a few dozen yards away, the solitude felt less like peace and more like loneliness. Morning came with the harsh cry of crows and the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. Cade woke immediately, a habit ingrained from years of wilderness living where sleeping too deeply could mean missing warning signs of danger. He rolled out of his bedroll and stood, stretching muscles still sore from yesterday's climb, and was surprised to see smoke already rising from Bethany's campfire. She was up, dressed in her practical clothing, with her hair braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat. A skillet sat on the fire, and the smell of bacon made his stomach growl. "Good morning," she called when she saw him approaching. "I hope you are hungry." "Always," he admitted, "but you did not have to cook for me. You are helping with my survey. The least I can do is share breakfast." She flipped the bacon expertly. "Besides, I make excellent coffee, and I suspect you are the type of man who appreciates that." She was right. Cade poured himself a cup from the pot, keeping warm at the edge of the fire, and had to admit it was better than his usual rough brew. They ate together as the sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Bethany laid out her plans for the day, showing him sketches of birds she had seen and explaining what observations she still needed to make. Cade found himself drawn into her enthusiasm, offering suggestions about where they might find certain species based on his knowledge of the terrain. "The hawk nest I mentioned is about 2 miles downstream," he said. "The approach is easier, and I can rig a secure line if you want to get close for photographs." "That would be perfect." Bethany's eyes shone with excitement. "I need to get detailed images of the nest construction and, if possible, the eggs or chicks." They packed supplies and set out after breakfast, following the river downstream. Cade led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats or points of interest. Bethany walked beside him when the terrain allowed it, her own gaze alert for any bird activity. She paused frequently to make notes in a small leather journal, sketching quick studies of birds they spotted or jotting down observations about behavior. Each time she stopped, Cade waited patiently, fascinated by her complete absorption in her work. When she looked at the world, she saw layers of detail he had never considered, patterns and connections that painted a richer picture of the landscape he thought he knew so well. "There," he said softly, pointing to a cliff face that rose about 30 feet from the riverbank. "See that ledge near the top? The hawk's nest there." Bethany pulled out a small telescope and trained it on the spot, her breath caught. "I can see the nest, and there is an adult bird. Cade, this is perfect." He studied the cliff, planning their approach. Unlike yesterday's disaster, this rock face had a relatively easy route to a point about 15 feet below the nest. From there, he could set up a secure belay system that would allow Bethany to climb higher safely. "We will need to approach carefully," he said. "I do not want to spook the bird." "Agreed. Let me get my camera ready." They spent the next hour setting up. Cade climbed to the midpoint first, testing handholds and establishing a solid anchor using rope and metal stakes he had packed. His muscles remembered yesterday's strain, but today's climb was easier, the rock more stable. Once he was secure, he lowered a rope for Bethany. "Remember," he called down, "do not try to climb faster than you are comfortable. The rope will hold you if you slip." Bethany tied the rope around her waist with practiced knots that surprised him, then began her ascent with her camera slung carefully across her back. She climbed well, he noticed, with a methodical approach that showed she had done this before despite yesterday's disaster. Within minutes, she reached his position. "Now what?" she asked, slightly breathless but grinning with excitement. "Now I anchor you here and you can climb up closer to the nest. I will have the rope the entire time. You will not fall." He set up the belay system, double-checking every knot and anchor point. Then he helped her into a proper harness made from loops of rope, showing her how to use it to support her weight. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." Bethany climbed higher, moving carefully toward the hawk's nest. Cade kept tension on the rope, ready to catch her if she slipped. His muscles were taut with concentration, but there was also pride in watching her work. She was meticulous and patient, waiting for long moments between movements to avoid startling the bird. When she reached a position about 6 feet from the nest, she signaled for him to hold. Then, moving with agonizing slowness, she brought out her camera and began taking photographs. The adult hawk watched her warily but did not fly, perhaps recognizing that this strange intruder was not an immediate threat. Cade could hear Bethany's soft murmurs of delight as she worked. 20 minutes passed, then 30. His arms ached from holding the rope steady, but he did not complain. This was important to her, and somehow that made it important to him. Finally, she signaled that she was done. He helped her descend, and when she reached his position, her face was radiant with joy. "I got them," she breathed. Perfect shots of the nest, the adult bird, and I could see at least 2 chicks. "Cade, this is exactly what the Smithsonian needed." Her happiness was infectious. "Then it was worth freezing in this position for half an hour. You were wonderful." On impulse, she threw her arms around him in a quick hug. "Thank you so much." The embrace lasted only a moment, but Cade felt it in his bones. The warmth of her body against his, the scent of her hair, the pure joy radiating from her. When she pulled back, there was a faint blush on her cheeks, as if she had surprised herself with the gesture. "We should get down before my arms give out," he said gruffly, covering the sudden emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. They descended together, and once they were safely on the ground, Bethany immediately began making notes about what she had observed. Cade busied himself coiling the rope and packing his gear, sneaking glances at her bent head, the way her hand flew across the page, the slight smile that curved her lips. The rest of the day passed in similar fashion. They explored the river valley, with Bethany documenting every bird they encountered, and Cade ensuring she stayed safe while doing it. They worked together with an ease that surprised them both, as if they had been partners for years rather than days. As the sun began to set, they made their way back to camp. Bethany walked with a slight limp, her legs tired from all the climbing and hiking, but she was still chattering excitedly about the day's discoveries. "I cannot believe how much we accomplished," she said as they reached the grove. "At this rate, I will have more than enough data for my survey." "You do good work," Cade said simply. "We do good work," she corrected. "I could not have gotten those photographs without you." They prepared dinner together, falling into an easy rhythm. Cade caught fish from the river while Bethany prepared vegetables from her supplies. They cooked over the fire and ate as the stars emerged overhead, talking about everything and nothing. Cade found himself sharing stories he had not told anyone in years. About growing up in Montana, about his father who had been a trapper and his mother who had died when he was young, about the restlessness that had driven him south, seeking new horizons and new challenges. And Bethany told him about her unconventional upbringing following her surveyor father across the country, about her mother who had encouraged her scientific pursuits even when society frowned upon women in such fields, about her determination to make her own mark on the world of natural science. "Your parents sound remarkable," Cade said. "They were. I miss them both terribly, but I try to honor their memory by living fully, by pursuing my passions." She smiled sadly. "Though I suppose nearly falling off a cliff is not exactly what they would have wanted for me." "They would be proud of you," Cade said with certainty. "Anyone would be." Bethany met his eyes across the fire, and something passed between them, a recognition that what was developing between them went beyond simple attraction or the camaraderie of shared work. There was a connection forming, deep and undeniable, built on respect and understanding, and something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. The days that followed settled into a pattern. They rose with the sun, shared breakfast, and then set out to continue Bethany's survey. Cade proved invaluable, his knowledge of the land and its creatures complementing Bethany's scientific expertise perfectly. He could track animals to their nesting sites, predict where they would be at certain times of day, and most importantly, keep Bethany safe while she pursued her passion. And with each day they grew closer. Small touches became more frequent, lingering moments when their hands brushed or when he helped her over difficult terrain. The conversation deepened, moving from polite exchanges to real vulnerability. They laughed together at the antics of prairie dogs, marveled together at the beauty of an eagle soaring overhead, and sat in comfortable silence when words were not needed. On the fifth day, they encountered their first real danger. They were exploring a canyon several miles from camp when Cade heard the distinctive rattle that made his blood run cold. He grabbed Bethany's arm, pulling her back just as a massive rattlesnake struck at where her foot had been about to land. "Do not move," he breathed, his body tense. The snake was coiled in the shadow of a rock, easily 5 feet long and thick as his wrist. It rattled again, a dry sound that spoke of ancient menace. Bethany had frozen at his command, her face pale but composed. Cade slowly reached for the hunting knife at his belt. He would have preferred to simply back away and let the snake be, but they were on a narrow trail with the canyon wall on one side and a drop on the other. The snake blocked their path forward, and backing up meant navigating blind around a bend they had just rounded. The snake struck again, lightning fast. Cade's blade flashed in the sunlight, catching the serpent behind the head and pinning it to the ground. It thrashed violently, but he held firm until the movement stilled. Only then did he release the breath he had been holding. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to Bethany. She nodded, though he could see the tremor in her hands. "That was close. Too close." His jaw tightened. "We need to be more careful. I should have been watching the ground better." "So should I. I was looking up at the canyon walls instead of where I was stepping." They made their way back to camp more cautiously after that, both sobered by the reminder that the wilderness was beautiful but unforgiving. That evening, Bethany sat closer to Cade by the fire than usual, and when her shoulder pressed against his arm, neither of them moved away. "I have been thinking," she said quietly, "about what you said that first day, about the dangers out here. Having second thoughts about staying. No, but I am grateful you are here, not just for today but for all of it. I have done field work before, but never alone like this. It is different having someone to share it with, better." Cade turned to look at her, finding her green eyes already on him. "It is better," he agreed softly. "I have lived alone for a long time, Bethany. I thought I preferred it that way. But these past few days with you have shown me what I have been missing." "What is that?" "Connection. Understanding. Someone who sees the world the way I do, who appreciates the small wonders." "I do not think I see the world the way you do," Bethany said, but there was warmth in her voice. "You see it as a place to survive and thrive in. I see it as a puzzle to be solved, but maybe those views are not so different after all." "Maybe not." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Bethany spoke again, her voice hesitant. "Cade, when this survey is done, what will you do? Will you go back to your solitary life in the mountains?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the things they had not yet said to each other. Cade considered his answer carefully. "I do not know," he admitted. "A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. But now, I am not so sure what I want anymore." "I have to return to Washington eventually," Bethany said. "The Smithsonian will expect a full report and I have other projects waiting, but I find myself not wanting this to end." "Neither do I." The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Cade reached out and took Bethany's hand, his large, calloused fingers enveloping her smaller, ink-stained ones. She squeezed back, and they sat like that until the fire died completely, and the night grew cold enough to drive them to their separate tents. But as Cade lay in his bedroll, he knew that something fundamental had shifted. Whatever was growing between him and Bethany Nash, it was real and undeniable. And the thought of watching her leave, of returning to his solitary existence without her, was becoming unbearable. The next morning brought a change in weather. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Cade studied the sky with a practiced eye. "Storm coming," he announced. "A big one from the look of it. We should secure the camp." They spent the morning preparing, tying down equipment, moving supplies into the tents, and digging drainage trenches around the tent sites. Bethany worked alongside Cade without complaint, following his instructions as he transformed their camp into a fortress against the coming storm. The rain arrived in the early afternoon, first as a light patter that quickly became a downpour. Thunder rolled across the plains and lightning split the darkened sky. Cade and Bethany retreated to their tents, and for several hours the storm raged around them. Cade was checking his tent stakes when he heard Bethany call out. He emerged into the rain to see water pouring into her tent through a tear in the canvas he had not noticed earlier. "Your tent is flooding," he shouted over the storm. "I know. My notes, my sketches, everything is getting soaked. Bring what you can. You will stay in my tent until the storm passes." Bethany did not argue. Together, they salvaged what they could from her tent, carrying armfuls of books, journals, and equipment through the driving rain to Cade's larger, more secure shelter. By the time they collapsed inside, both were soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Thank you," Bethany gasped, pushing wet hair out of her face. "If those notes had been ruined, weeks of work would have been lost. They are safe now." Cade was very aware of how small his tent suddenly felt with Bethany in it, how intimate the space was. "You should change into dry clothes." "I do not have any dry clothes here." He pulled out a spare shirt from his pack. "It will be huge on you, but it is dry and warm." Bethany accepted it gratefully. "Turn around." Cade obediently turned his back, giving her privacy as she changed out of her wet things. He tried not to think about the fact that she was mere feet away, tried not to hear the rustle of fabric or imagine what she looked like. When she told him it was safe to turn around, he found her drowning in his shirt, which hung nearly to her knees like a dress. Her legs were bare beneath it, and her hair hung in damp waves around her shoulders. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You are staring," she said softly, but there was no accusation in her tone. "I know." He made no apology for it. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the tent, a different kind of storm was brewing. They were alone, truly alone for the first time, with no work to distract them and nowhere to go. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. "I should tell you something," Bethany said, wrapping her arms around herself. "I have not been entirely honest with you." Cade's stomach tightened. "About what?" "About why I took this assignment. The Smithsonian survey is real, but it is not the only reason I came out here. After my father died, I inherited some money. Not a fortune, but enough to live on if I am careful. I could have stayed in Washington, worked in a laboratory or a museum. Safe, respectable work. But you came here instead. I came here because I wanted to prove something. To myself, to the men who told me I was too delicate for field work, to everyone who said women do not belong in the wilderness. I wanted to show that I could do this alone, that I did not need anyone's help or protection. And then you got stuck on that cliff." She laughed, though there were tears in her eyes. "And then I got stuck on that cliff, and you saved me, and now I do not know what to think anymore. I spent days being angry with myself for needing rescue, for proving everyone right. But these past few days with you have taught me something different. What is that? That needing someone does not make you weak. That accepting help is not the same as failing. That maybe, just maybe, some things are better when you do not do them alone." Cade moved closer to her, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice, the honesty in her eyes. "I learned something too," he said quietly. "I learned that isolation is not the same as strength, that I have been hiding out here, telling myself I prefer being alone when really I was just afraid. Afraid of what? Of this. Of feeling something for someone. Of caring enough that losing them would destroy me. And are you still afraid? He reached up and gently tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Terrified. But I do not want to run anymore. Bethany leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, they were bright with emotion. Neither do I. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. Cade cupped her face in his hands, giving her every chance to pull away, but instead, she rose on her toes to meet him. Their lips touched softly at first, tentative and questioning. Then Bethany's hands came up to grip his still damp shirt, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and necessary. Cade pulled her closer, and she melted against him, her body fitting perfectly against his larger frame. He was intensely aware of every point of contact, the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of his borrowed shirt, the way her fingers tangled in his hair, the small sound she made in the back of her throat that sent fire racing through his veins. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bethany's lips were swollen and her cheeks were flushed. "I have wanted to do that for days," she admitted. "Since when?" "Since that first climb when you held me against your chest and promised you would not let me fall. Maybe even before that, when you first looked up at me on that cliff and I knew, somehow, that you would save me." Cade rested his forehead against hers. "I knew the moment I pulled you off that ledge, the moment I felt you trust me completely. Something shifted, and I have not been the same since." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the connection. The storm raged outside, but inside the tent, they had found something precious and rare. When they finally settled down, Bethany curled against Cade's chest, her head resting over his heart, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We figure it out together. I still have to go back to Washington, I know. But I do not want to lose this, lose you." Cade tightened his arms around her. "You will not. We will find a way." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, while the storm gradually spent its fury and moved on. When Cade woke in the gray light of pre-dawn, Bethany was still in his arms, her breathing deep and even. He lay there watching her sleep, marveling at how quickly she had become essential to him. The remaining days of the survey passed in a blur of work and growing intimacy. They continued documenting birds during the day, but the evenings were spent talking, planning, dreaming about a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Cade shared his tent with Bethany for the rest of their time by the river, neither willing to spend nights apart anymore. They discussed the practicalities of their situation with the same methodical approach Bethany brought to her scientific work. She had commitments in Washington that could not be ignored, and Cade had built a life in the wilderness that was not easy to transplant. But neither was willing to simply walk away from what they had found. "What if you came to Washington with me?" Bethany suggested one evening as they lay together watching the stars through the open tent flap. "You could work as a guide or a wilderness consultant. The Smithsonian is always looking for people with your expertise." "I would wither in a city," Cade said honestly. "Too many walls, too many people. I need open spaces." "Then what if I stayed here? I could continue my work from North Platte, do field work in the summer and write my reports in the winter." "You would be giving up your position at the Smithsonian, the respect you have earned, the network you have built. But I would have you, and this." She gestured at the vast landscape around them. "Is that not worth more?" Cade kissed her forehead. "I do not want you to sacrifice everything for me, but I also cannot imagine letting you go." "Then we find a compromise. What if we spent half the year in Washington and half the year here? I could maintain my work with the Smithsonian and still do field work. You could guide expeditions in the summer and have winters to yourself in the wilderness. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start. They talked through the details, planning and scheming like conspirators, finding joy in building a future together. On their last full day by the river, Cade took Bethany to a place he had never shown anyone else. It was a small canyon about 5 miles from their camp, where a waterfall tumbled into a clear pool surrounded by wildflowers. The walls of the canyon were painted in layers of red and gold stone, and the sound of falling water created a peaceful backdrop. "This is my favorite place in all of Nebraska," he told her as they stood at the edge of the pool. "I come here when I need to think or when the wilderness feels too big and I need to remember why I love it." "It is beautiful," Bethany breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Thank you for sharing it with me. I want to share everything with you." Cade took her hands in his. "Bethany, I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks. I know this is fast and probably foolish, but I love you. I love your courage and your passion and the way you see wonder in everything. I love how you challenge me and how you trust me. And I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Tears spilled down Bethany's cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since you climbed that cliff face to save me, since you looked at me like I was worth saving even when I was at my most foolish. You make me braver and stronger and more myself than I have ever been." They sealed their declarations with a kiss, and in that hidden canyon with the waterfall singing around them, they made promises to each other. No formal vows yet, but commitments nonetheless. To try to compromise, to build something lasting from this unexpected connection. That night, they returned to camp and began packing up, preparing for the journey back to North Platte. Bethany's survey was complete, her journals filled with observations and sketches, her photographs documenting species that had never been properly recorded before. It was the culmination of weeks of hard work, but neither of them felt the triumph they should have. Instead, there was a bittersweet quality to their preparations, an acknowledgement that this chapter of their story was ending even as a new one prepared to begin. They reached North Platte 2 days later, riding into town in the late afternoon. The settlement had grown since Cade's last visit months ago. New buildings sprouting up along the main street, the railroad bringing prosperity and people to the Nebraska plains. It felt cramped and noisy after weeks in the wilderness, and Cade found himself tensing as they navigated the crowded streets. Bethany noticed his discomfort and squeezed his hand. "We do not have to stay long. Just a few days to resupply and send my initial findings to the Smithsonian." They arranged for separate rooms at the hotel, mindful of propriety even though they both knew where they would actually be sleeping. The proprietor, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, looked between them with knowing expression but said nothing. That evening, Cade cleaned up for the first time in weeks, trimming his beard and changing into clothes that were not stained with trail dust. When he met Bethany in the hotel dining room, he barely recognized the elegant woman in the green dress who rose to greet him. She had tamed her hair into an elaborate style and wore jewelry he had not known she possessed. "You look beautiful," he said, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt in civilized surroundings. "You look uncomfortable," she countered with a smile. "Come on. Let us get through dinner, and then we can escape back to being ourselves." The meal was an exercise in patience for Cade, who was unused to the rituals of proper dining. But watching Bethany navigate the social niceties with practiced ease, he caught a glimpse of the life she had in Washington, the world she moved through with confidence. It made him wonder anew if she could truly be happy splitting her time between that world and his. As if reading his thoughts, Bethany reached across the table and took his hand. "Stop worrying," she said quietly. "This is not who I am. This is just a costume I wear when necessary. The real me is the woman who was covered in dust and climbing cliffs with you. Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything." They spent 3 days in North Platte. Bethany arranged for her findings to be shipped to the Smithsonian and sent a telegram explaining that she would be staying in Nebraska longer than originally planned. Cade helped her purchase supplies for an extended stay and introduced her to the few people in town he knew and trusted. On the third evening, they were having dinner in the hotel when a tall, distinguished-looking man approached their table. He was perhaps 50 years old, impeccably dressed, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority. "Miss Nash?" he inquired. "Bethany Nash." Bethany looked up in surprise. "Yes, I am Bethany Nash. Can I help you?" "I am Thomas Whitmore, director of the Western Regional Bureau for the Smithsonian. I was in town on other business when I received word you were here. I wanted to speak with you about your survey work." Bethany gestured to an empty chair at their table. "Please join us. This is Cade Rawlins. He has been assisting with my fieldwork." Whitmore shook Cade's hand with a firm grip before sitting. "I have reviewed the preliminary findings you sent, Miss Nash, and I must say they are exceptional. The documentation of the hawk species alone is worth the entire cost of the expedition. The board is extremely pleased." "Thank you. I had excellent help." Bethany smiled at Cade. "So I understand, which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you." Whitmore leaned forward. "The Smithsonian is planning a much larger survey of the Western Territories. We want to document the entire ecosystem, from the plains to the mountains, over the course of several years. It would be the most comprehensive natural history study ever undertaken in this region, and we want you to lead it." Bethany's eyes widened. "Lead it? But surely there are more experienced naturalists who would be better suited for such an undertaking." "More experienced, perhaps, but not more capable. Your work shows an eye for detail and a willingness to take risks that we need for this project. And frankly, Miss Nash, you have proven that a woman can do this work just as well as any man. That matters to those of us trying to open more opportunities in the sciences." "I am honored. Truly. But such a project would require years of commitment, living in the field for extended periods." "I am not sure I am prepared for that." Whitmore glanced at Cade. "What if we made provisions for you to have an assistant, someone with extensive knowledge of the terrain and survival skills? We would pay a fair wage, of course." The implication was clear, and Bethany and Cade exchanged glances. Here was the solution they had been searching for, handed to them by chance or fate. "How long do we have to decide?" Bethany asked. "The project would not begin until next spring, so several months. But I would need to know soon so we can begin organizing the expedition." Whitmore stood. "Think it over and send word to my office in Omaha. This is an extraordinary opportunity, Miss Nash, for both of you." After he left, Bethany and Cade sat in stunned silence. "Did that just happen?" Bethany finally asked. "I think it did. Cade, this could be perfect. We could work together, spend our time in the wilderness doing what we love, and I could continue my career. It is everything we talked about, all in one package. It is a big commitment, years in the field, constantly moving, hard living. But together." She grasped his hands. "We would be together." Cade could not help but smile at her enthusiasm. "Then I suppose you should tell him yes." "We should tell him yes. This is both of our decision." They talked late into the night, discussing the practicalities and possibilities. The more they talked, the more certain they became that this was the right path. It would not be easy, but it would be theirs, built on their terms. The next morning, Bethany composed a telegram to Thomas Whitmore accepting the position and proposing Cade as her chief assistant. By afternoon, they had a response agreeing to all their terms and inviting them to Omaha in 2 weeks to discuss details and sign contracts. With that settled, they left North Platte and returned to the wilderness. But this time, they were not heading back to Bethany's survey site. Instead, Cade led her to his cabin, a sturdy structure he had built himself in the foothills several days' ride from town. It was isolated and rough, but it was home, and he wanted to share it with her. The cabin was larger than Bethany expected, with a main room featuring a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft above. Cade had built it well, with tight walls and a solid roof, and while it was sparsely furnished, it was clean and well maintained. "I know it is not much," Cade said as Bethany explored, "but it is mine, or ours if you want it to be." "I want it to be," she assured him. "It is perfect." They spent the next 2 weeks living together in the cabin, establishing routines and rhythms that felt natural and right. Cade taught Bethany how to hunt and trap, how to read weather signs and track animals. Bethany organized his sparse possessions and filled the cabin with small touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a shelter. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about their future. The Smithsonian project would not begin until spring, which gave them the winter to prepare. They discussed what equipment they would need, where they might establish base camps, what species should be priorities for documentation. But more than that, they talked about themselves. Cade told Bethany about the loneliness that had driven him into the wilderness, the feeling of never quite fitting in anywhere until he found the mountains. Bethany shared her own struggles with being taken seriously as a scientist, the constant battle to prove herself in a field dominated by men. "I used to think I had to be alone to be strong," Bethany confessed one night as they lay together in Cade's bed, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. "That if I relied on anyone, it meant I was weak. And now I know that loving you makes me stronger. That we can be independent and together at the same time. That may be the strongest thing I ever did was let you help me off that cliff." Cade pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "The strongest thing I ever did was climb up in the first place. I had lived alone so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's life more than my own." They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of deep emotion and lasting commitment. Afterward, as Bethany slept in his arms, Cade lay awake thinking about how much his life had changed in a matter of weeks. He had gone from a solitary existence to imagining a future filled with partnership and purpose. And it all started with a woman stranded on a cliff, and his decision to climb up and bring her down. When the time came to travel to Omaha for their meeting with Thomas Whitmore, they went as partners in every sense of the word. The meeting was productive, with Whitmore laying out the scope of the Smithsonian project and the role he envisioned for them. They would start in the spring, working their way west from Nebraska through Wyoming and into the Montana Territory over the course of several years, documenting flora and fauna, geological features, and indigenous cultures. "It is ambitious," Whitmore admitted, "perhaps overly so. But with the railroad expanding and settlements pushing further west, we have a limited window to document these ecosystems before they change forever. Your work will be invaluable to future generations of scientists." The contracts were signed, the plans were made, and they returned to Cade's cabin with a sense of excited anticipation. They had the entire winter to prepare, and they threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm. But as autumn turned to winter and the first snows began to fall, Cade found himself thinking about something else. He and Bethany were building a life together, planning years of shared work and adventure. But there was one thing missing, one commitment they had not yet made official. On a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Cade pulled Bethany onto his lap as they sat in his favorite chair. "I have something to ask you," he said, his heart pounding with nervousness that he had not felt since that first climb to rescue her. Bethany looked up at him with those green eyes that still took his breath away. "What is it?" "We have planned everything else, but there is one thing we have not discussed. Bethany Nash, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever adventures life brings us?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling brighter than the sun. "Yes. Yes, of course I will marry you. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Cade kissed her deeply, sealing the promise they were making to each other. He did not have a ring to offer her, not yet, but that did not seem to matter to either of them. What mattered was the commitment, the choice they were making to bind their lives together. They were married in North Platte on a bright January morning in 1879, with Thomas Whitmore standing as witness along with a handful of townspeople who had gotten to know them over the past months. Bethany wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, and Cade had gotten a proper suit made for the occasion, though he still looked more comfortable in buckskin. The ceremony was brief and to the point, conducted by a circuit judge who happened to be passing through town. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Cade swept Bethany into his arms and kissed her to the applause of their small audience. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, but the next morning they set out for the cabin, eager to return to their wilderness home. The winter months that followed were some of the happiest of Cade's life. He and Bethany lived in comfortable isolation, working together to prepare for the coming expedition, but also simply enjoying being together. They established morning routines where Bethany would read while Cade prepared breakfast, and evening rituals where Cade would work on equipment repairs while Bethany sketched or wrote in her journals. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies with the same patient attention they brought to studying the natural world, and they talked, endlessly, about everything. Their conversations ranged from the practical to the philosophical, from discussions of bird migration patterns to debates about the nature of consciousness. Cade had never had someone who engaged his mind the way Bethany did, who challenged him to think more deeply and see more clearly. Winter began to soften into early spring, and with it came the preparations for their first expedition. Supplies arrived from Omaha, including specialized equipment for documentation and preservation, a new camera for Bethany, and detailed maps of the territories they would be exploring. They left the cabin in late March, heading west into Wyoming. Thomas Whitmore had arranged for them to meet up with a small support team in Cheyenne, including a cartographer and a translator who spoke several indigenous languages. The plan was to spend the entire summer and fall working their way through the Wind River Range, documenting the unique alpine ecosystems found there. The work was exactly what Bethany had dreamed of, and exactly what Cade needed. They spent their days hiking through pristine wilderness, cataloging species, taking photographs, and making detailed observations. Bethany's scientific training combined with Cade's practical knowledge created a partnership that produced work of exceptional quality. But beyond the work, they were building a marriage. Living in close quarters, facing challenges together, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating successes together, they grew closer with each passing day. The love that had sparked on a cliff face in Nebraska deepened into something enduring and profound. They encountered their share of hardships, a bout of food poisoning that left them both weak for days, a close call with a grizzly bear that reminded them how dangerous their work could be, a flash flood that destroyed a week's worth of notes and specimens, forcing them to redo that segment of their survey. But they also experienced moments of transcendent beauty. Watching the sunrise from a mountain peak at 10,000 feet, with the world spread out below them in shades of gold and purple. Discovering a previously undocumented species of alpine flower growing in a hidden valley. Sitting by their campfire under a sky so full of stars, it looked like diamonds spilled on black velvet, holding hands and feeling completely content. As summer turned to fall, they completed the first phase of their survey and returned to North Platte for the winter. They spent the cold months writing up their findings, preparing specimens for shipment to the Smithsonian, and planning the next year's expedition. It was during this winter that Bethany discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a mix of joy and apprehension. A child would change everything, would complicate their ability to continue fieldwork in the way they had been doing. "We will figure it out," Cade assured her, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "We have faced bigger challenges than this." "Have we?" Bethany asked with a shaky laugh. "I am not sure anything prepares you for parenthood. Then we will learn together, the way we have learned everything else." They modified their plans for the coming year, arranging to do their fieldwork earlier in the summer so Bethany would be back in North Platte well before the baby was due. Thomas Whitmore was accommodating, understanding that this was a temporary adjustment rather than an end to their work. Their second summer expedition was cut shorter than planned, but they still managed to complete significant survey work in the Medicine Bow Mountains. And when they returned to North Platte in August, it was with a sense of excitement about the new chapter about to begin. Bethany gave birth in early October 1880 to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel, after Bethany's father, and from the moment Cade held his son for the first time, he felt a love so fierce and protective it staggered him. Parenthood changed them both. Cade discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, learning to function on little sleep and finding joy in the smallest milestones of his son's development. Bethany balanced her scientific work with motherhood in ways that amazed him, writing reports and analyzing data while nursing Daniel or rocking him to sleep. They spent that winter in North Platte, rather than returning to the cabin, wanting to be near the town's doctor while Daniel was so small. But come spring, they were ready to resume their work, this time bringing their son with them. The Smithsonian had initially balked at the idea of an infant on expedition, but Bethany and Cade had been firm. They were a family now, and they would work as a family. Thomas Whitmore had eventually agreed, perhaps recognizing that trying to separate them would mean losing their valuable contributions entirely. So they developed a new way of working, with one parent always staying at base camp with Daniel while the other ventured out for shorter survey trips. It was not ideal, but it allowed them to continue their research while keeping their family together. The years that followed were full and rich. They spent summers in the field, exploring the Rocky Mountains from Colorado to Montana, documenting the incredible biodiversity of the region. Winters were spent in North Platte, where they had eventually purchased a small house that served as their home base. The house was modest but comfortable, with a large workroom where they could process their findings and enough land for a garden and a few horses. Daniel grew from infant to toddler to young boy, learning to walk in mountain meadows and developing a love for the outdoors that delighted both his parents. By the time he was 4, he could identify dozens of bird species by sight and sound, a natural naturalist like his mother. In 1883, Bethany gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah. Where Daniel was adventurous and bold, Sarah was thoughtful and observant, content to sit for hours watching insects or studying flowers. Both children thrived in the unconventional life their parents had created. The Smithsonian survey continued for 6 years, producing a comprehensive documentation of Western ecosystems that would be used by scientists for generations to come. Bethany and Cade's work became highly respected in scientific circles, and they were invited to present their findings at conferences and universities back east. They made one trip to Washington when Daniel was 5 and Sarah was 2, and while it was gratifying to receive recognition for their work, both Cade and Bethany were relieved to return to the West. The crowded cities and rigid social conventions felt suffocating after years of wilderness living. When the formal survey finally concluded in 1884, they faced a decision about what to do next. The Smithsonian wanted them to continue their work, perhaps expanding into the Southwest Territories. But Cade and Bethany found themselves craving something different, a chance to put down deeper roots. They chose to settle permanently in North Platte, using the money they had saved and the proceeds from their published work to buy a larger property on the outskirts of town. The land included a good-sized house, several outbuildings, and backed onto public lands where they could continue exploring and studying nature. Cade built a proper laboratory for Bethany, where she could work on her research and writing. She began teaching as well, first informally to other women in the community interested in natural science, and eventually establishing a small school that attracted students from across the region. Cade served as a guide and consultant, taking expeditions out into the wilderness and sharing his knowledge with a new generation of explorers. He also worked with local ranchers, helping them understand how to manage their land in ways that preserved the native ecosystems while still making a living. Their life settled into a comfortable rhythm, balancing work and family, adventure and stability. They still took trips into the wilderness, sometimes all together as a family, and sometimes just the two of them when they needed to reconnect with the landscape and with each other. One such trip came in the summer of 1888, when they returned to the spot where they had first met. The cliff where Bethany had been stranded looked different now, weathered by a decade of storms, but the river still flowed and the hawks still nested in the rocks. "You ever regret it?" Cade asked as they stood looking up at that ledge. "Getting stuck up there, needing to be rescued?" Bethany slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Never. Getting stuck on that cliff was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me you." "You brought me back to life," Cade said seriously. "I did not even realize how isolated I had become until you forced me to connect again. Everything good in my life now came from climbing up that rock face to help you." "We saved each other," Bethany said softly. "You saved me from falling, and I saved you from loneliness. I would say that makes us even." They kissed there beside the river, just as they had so many times before, but this kiss carried the weight of a decade together, of 2 children raised and a life built from nothing but love and determination. The years continued to pass, bringing changes but never diminishing the connection between them. Daniel grew into a young man with his father's height and strength, and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He studied geology at university, but always returned home to Nebraska, drawn by the same landscapes that had captivated his parents. Sarah developed into a talented artist and naturalist, creating detailed illustrations of plants and animals that were scientifically accurate and aesthetically beautiful. Her work began to be published in scientific journals before she was even 20, and Bethany could not have been more proud. Cade and Bethany grew older together, their hair silvering and their faces weathering like the rocks they had climbed so many times. But the love between them never weathered. If anything, it deepened, becoming as much a part of them as breathing. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, their children threw them a party at the house, inviting friends from across the region. There were speeches and toasts, Stories told and retold about the famous naturalists who had documented the West and raised a family while doing it. But the moment Cade treasured most came late in the evening, when he and Bethany slipped away from the party to walk down to the creek that ran through their property. The summer night was warm, and fireflies danced in the darkness like tiny stars fallen to earth. 20 years, Bethany marveled, leaning against Cade's chest as his arms wrapped around her from behind. It feels like yesterday and like forever all at once. Best 20 years of my life, Cade murmured against her hair, and I look forward to 20 more. At least 20 more, she agreed. We have a lot of living left to do. They stood there in the darkness, listening to the creek babble and the distant sounds of their children laughing at the party. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life that honored both their independence and their commitment, who had proven that love and partnership could thrive even in the wildest places. The story of how they met, with Bethany stranded on a cliff and Cade climbing up to save her, became a legend in North Platte. People told it to their children as an example of courage and serendipity, of how sometimes the most terrifying moments can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. But for Cade and Bethany, it was simply their beginning, the foundation upon which they had built everything else. And as they grew old together, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren, they never forgot that moment when their eyes first met 50 feet above the Platte River, when a mountain man looked up at a stranded woman and decided to climb. Years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of seasons. Daniel married a teacher from town and built a house on the edge of their property, staying close to the land he loved. Sarah married a fellow naturalist and split her time between Nebraska and various research stations across the West, following in her parents' footsteps in her own way. Cade and Bethany became grandparents 4 times over, and nothing delighted them more than taking their grandchildren on walks through the wilderness, teaching them to identify plants and animals, to read the signs of changing weather, to respect and appreciate the natural world. In 1906, when they were both in their 60s, the Smithsonian published a comprehensive volume of their life's work. The book became a standard reference in natural history, filled with Bethany's meticulous observations and Sarah's beautiful illustrations, representing decades of patient study and deep love for the Western landscapes. At the book launch in Omaha, an aging Thomas Whitmore gave a speech about how Bethany and Cade had revolutionized field research, proving that long-term studies conducted by dedicated partners could yield insights that short expeditions never could. But more than that, he said, they had shown that science and life did not have to be separate, that it was possible to pursue knowledge while building a family, to be both rigorous researchers and devoted parents and partners. That night in their hotel room, Cade and Bethany paged through the book together, marveling at how their years of work had been transformed into something lasting and meaningful. "Your father would be so proud," Cade said, knowing how much Bethany still missed the surveyor who had first taught her to see the world with curious eyes. "Both our parents would be," Bethany replied. "We built something neither of them could have imagined, but I think they would have understood why. They would have seen that we were following the same drive that motivated them, the need to explore and understand and document." "We did good work," Cade agreed. "But the work I am most proud of is this," he gestured between them. "Us, our family, the life we built together. Me too. The science matters, but it is not what made my life meaningful. You did that. You and our children and all the small moments in between the grand adventures." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, bodies that had changed over the years but hearts that had only grown more connected. And afterward, As Bethany slept in his arms, Cade thought about that young man who had heard a scream echo through a canyon 28 years ago. How different his life would have been if he had ignored it, if he had been somewhere else that day, if he had not had the skills or courage to climb up and help. But he had heard it. He had climbed. And in doing so, he had found not just a woman to save, but a partner to build a life with, a love that had sustained them both through decades of joy and challenge. The final years of their lives were peaceful. They spent their days at the Nebraska property, tending their garden, writing occasional articles, and enjoying visits from children and grandchildren. Cade's body bore the marks of a life lived hard, old climbing injuries that ached in cold weather, but his mind stayed sharp and his spirit remained strong. Bethany developed arthritis that made it difficult to hold a pen for long periods, so Cade learned to take dictation, writing down her observations and thoughts as she spoke them. It was a role reversal that amused them both. The mountain man turned secretary for the scientist. On warm evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the Nebraska plains, the sky turning shades of orange and purple that never got old no matter how many times they witnessed it. Sometimes they talked, reminiscing about their adventures or discussing current events. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, needing no words to communicate their contentment. Bethany passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1915. She was 71 years old and had lived a life fuller and richer than most people could imagine. Cade found her in the morning, still and cold in their bed, and while the grief was immense, there was also gratitude. She had not suffered, had not been diminished by long illness. She had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. He buried her in the small family cemetery on their property, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the creek. Daniel and Sarah stood with him as he said goodbye to the woman who had been his partner for 36 years. And though the pain was sharp, there was also peace in knowing how lucky he had been to have her at all. Cade lived another 3 years after Bethany's death. He stayed on the property, cared for by his children but still independent, still taking daily walks through the land they had loved together. He wrote letters to old friends and colleagues, sharing memories and offering wisdom gained from a life fully lived. He spent hours reading through Bethany's journals, reliving their adventures through her meticulous observations and occasional personal notes. In the margins of one entry from their first summer together, she had written, "Today Cade showed me a family of foxes denning in the rocks. He moves so carefully around them, with such respect. I think I might be falling in love with him." Cade smiled when he read that, remembering that day, remembering the way he had been fighting his own growing feelings, afraid to acknowledge what was happening between them. How young they had been, how uncertain. And yet they had taken the leap, had trusted in what they felt, and it had carried them through nearly 4 decades of partnership. On a warm June evening in 1918, Cade sat on his porch watching the sunset, thinking about Bethany and their life together. His heart, which had never quite recovered from losing her, simply stopped. Daniel found him there the next morning, still sitting in his chair, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. They buried him next to Bethany, and at the funeral, Daniel told the story of how his parents had met. The story everyone knew, about a woman stranded on a cliff face and a mountain man who climbed up to save her. But Daniel added something that perhaps not everyone understood. "My father climbed that cliff to save my mother's life," he said. "But in doing so, she saved his life too." They rescued each other, in all the ways that matter. And in building a life together, they showed all of us what true partnership looks like. What love looks like when it is based on respect and shared passion and unwavering commitment. The legacy Cade and Bethany left behind was more than scientific. Their work continued to influence natural historians for generations. But more importantly, they had shown that it was possible to live unconventionally, to pursue dreams while building a family, to be true to yourself while being committed to another person. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would grow up hearing stories about them, about the brave scientist who nearly died on a cliff and the strong mountain man who saved her, about how they fell in love in the wilderness and built a partnership that lasted decades, about how they proved that sometimes the most dangerous moments can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. The cliff where they first met still stands beside the Platte River, worn by time but enduring. Hawks still nest in its crevices, just as they did that August day in 1878 when Bethany Nash made a foolish decision to climb too high, and Cade Rawlins heard her scream and decided to help. And if you visit North Platte today, you can see the house where they lived, now preserved as a museum showcasing their scientific work and their remarkable lives. You can walk through Bethany's laboratory, see Cade's climbing equipment, page through their journals and look at their photographs. But the real story is not in the artifacts or the scientific achievements. The real story is in the love that sustained them, the partnership they built, the family they raised, and the example they set. Two people from different worlds who found each other against all odds and chose every day to build a life together. It started with a scream echoing through a canyon, and a man brave enough to climb toward danger instead of away from it. It continued with trust given and returned, with challenges faced side by side, with a love that deepened rather than faded over time. And it ended the way the best love stories do, with two lives fully lived, two hearts completely given, and a legacy that endures long after the final sunset. Bethany Nash was stranded on a rock face 50 feet above the river. Cade Rawlins climbed up and brought her down, and in doing so they found not just safety but love, not just rescue but partnership, not just survival but a life worth living. Together.